Let me tell you a little story. Back in 2001, who was in business already in 2001? You were working already? Who was working on 2001? Yeah, so some of you remember. Back in 2001, we were struggling with EJBs, and we were doing this kind of EJB J2E patterns. Very great stuff from Sun. And it was full of DAOs and DTOs and everything like this, like factories around all these things. And at some point, some people started to complain and say, so there's something wrong with that. Fortunately, there was, some time later, we got something better, a new book. And in this book, there was the word repository. So most everything started to rename their DAOs into repository. And finding out they were all kind of similar. So ended up with generic repositories, and wow, not again. That's not domain-driven design. It's not DDD. It turns out that most of us have ended up misapplying domain-driven design, considering it was something technical. It's not. So what's DDD? That was the teaser. So who am I? I'm a passionate developer since a lot of time. On Twitter, I'm Siriux. You can follow me. I tweet a lot about professional stuff and domain-driven design. I'm from Paris, and I founded the Paris Software Craftsmanship Community in Paris in 2011. We still meet every month between professionals to become better professional, and we talk about all things test-driven development and all these things. I'm also the co-founder and CTO of a company called Arola, and at Arola we are 80 consultants now, all passionate about everything DD. XDD. So you see, domain-driven design is part of them, and it's helpful for legacy too. So back to our initial questions. What's domain-driven design? First, it's a book. You know the book. We call it the Blue Book. It's like the Bible. But this book is hard to read. DDD is from this man, Eric Evans. Here he's doing the training, a good training. It's a 4-day training. The book is made of patterns, a lot of patterns, and we don't have the time to cover them all today. We'll see just a few of them. Domain-driven design is a topic for senior developers. When we do DDD meetups, most of the people who show up have 7 years of experience or more, like 15, 20 years, 25 years of experience. As if at the beginning of your career, you consider you are looking for solutions, everything, everywhere, technical solutions like frameworks, technologies, new languages. And after some time, you find out that the real solutions are not there. And you try something else, and you find out things like domain-driven design. That's totally normal. Domain-driven design is well respected by many thought leaders, even if they don't talk about it. But it's often mistaken. If you look at blogs on the web, many blogs focus on the wrong thing. You don't need any tool for domain-driven design. And many people discovered about domain-driven design because of SecureOS and Greg Young. And maybe that's your case too. I don't know. So when I do the DDD training, I do a 2-day training. That's the map of every topic I cover in 2 days. But today, we don't have the time, so I will just cover the most important ones, which are just the things at the top, which are there as well. And because it's very abstract, we need a lot of examples. You like examples? Well, I'll give you examples. This was abstract already. So, example, please. So, domain-driven design, it all starts with domain experts. And domain experts, you know these ads for toothpaste? These kind of domain experts are like this, but in real life, they look just like you. They are your domain expert that you have a hard time finding out, meeting. So domain-driven design starts with domain experts. You need to have access to them, and they tell you things. For example, they tell you things like, please add a discount code to the purchase. And you reply, oh, you mean the shopping cart? Oh, yeah, of course, that's what I meant. And then you say, all right, so let's add the voucher field to the basket model. Ah! You see? What happened there? We had 3 different names. They were talking about purchase, you were talking about shopping cart in natural language, and the code is talking basket model. Bah, that's bad. It's I call that confusion as a service. You spend your time translating everything between different names, between different people. And you waste time during every meeting, every time you have conversations, you waste time for that, and you create confusions. So the solution from domain-driven design is to focus on the language as a first-class citizen, as a developer job. We have this concept called ubiquitous language, which means that we want to talk the domain language. Domain can be insurance, finance, I don't know, shipping, whatever. But that's the domain language that we want to talk everyone. So many domains already have their language. Like if you are in building stairways, you have a complete, very mature language like this. You have steps, step growths, starting step. You know, the first step is not the first step, it's the starting step. You don't have a collection of steps. No, it's a flight of stairs. And you should find this name in your code at the end. So a good ubiquitous language has to have very good names. They have to be searchable. They have to be easy to pronounce. Abbreviations are not a good idea. And the definition should be shared by everyone. Actually, we want everyone to understand a bit about the domain. And the more, the better. And it's kind of, we want something formal. We want definitions that have very precise meaning. So your best friend is your thesaurus. And a thesaurus is a special kind of dinosaurs. And when you ask, so you see, it was supposed to be a joke, but nobody's laughing. No way, never. So it's always a bad joke. And that's a thesaurus. That's my best friend. So basically, domain-driven design is all about everyone talking the domain language, everywhere, even in the code. Yeah, we can talk to the code too. We talk to our colleagues and we talk to the code. I increasingly see the code as one more colleagues in my team. So what does it mean in practice? This means that if I look at, sorry, it's in Eclipse. If I look at all the outline of the project, every name here, interfaces names, enums names, class names, and the methods inside, the public methods inside, they are all meaningful for domain people, for business people. I can bring the guy in suit or the girl from the business, and they can see that, and they should understand most of it. It should be obvious for them. That's what it means to talk the domain language in your code. And there's one way you can test your existing application to test if you are doing that correctly. It's just a simple word cloud. In Java, you can do it with a grep or just parsing files, ignoring the punctuation of Java and all the keywords. And what you end up with, if you end up with this, your domain is string manipulations, or your domain language is totally lost in your code. If you end up with that, it's much better. Here we are in a fleet management system, so cars, and monitoring fuel cards especially. So we can see a lot of things about fuel card transactions, vehicles, anomalies, fuel quality, all these things. So that's much better already. So you can do that when you come back to your office to find out if you are really talking the domain language in your code. So talking the domain language in your code and having the domain language everywhere and with no technical pollution is not easy. It takes a lot of discipline, like keeping every framework and every technology out on a separate module or on a separate package, and have the domain stuff separated on its own module or package. Null is not welcome at all. There should be no null. And you can always avoid null. You can do null object or optional, and they are not the same. Most of the time, I would go the null object and keep the optional just for the few cases where the emptiness really makes sense as an explicit emptiness. One simple trick which helps a lot doing that, everything more domain in your code, is just to follow blindly the object calisthenics. So just keep it as a pointer and try to apply that as a game in your code, and you can really do that all the time. All the time. It sounds terrible, right? I don't have the right to do what I want. So we have the ubiquitous language everywhere. So at this point, you could say that, hey, Cyril, so you mean that domain-driven design is primarily just talking business domain everywhere? And I can say, yes. All right, that was the end of this talk. I hope you enjoyed. That's no, sorry. And please buy my book. It's not on DDD, it's on living documentation, a very similar topic. And I hope you enjoyed this conference. And no, sorry, I'm kidding. But I really have a book. So back to domain-driven design. What if if we didn't have the time anymore, and maybe there was a fire siren or fire alert or something, I would have done the most important part already. So we are already mostly done already. That's very important. So domain-driven design takes a lot of extra care, extra attention, and it takes some time, which means we don't want to do all this attention everywhere by default. We want to do it where it really matters. So when to apply domain-driven design? Imagine you have an application to detect payment frauds. That's not something very easy to do. You are not even sure to succeed doing that. So there is a risk, and the risk is in the domain of detecting fraud. That's an excellent case of doing domain-driven design. The smarter, the deeper you understand your domain, the better you'll be as a business. That's the perfect case for domain-driven design. More generally, every time you want to develop a feature to beat the competition, the value is in the domain, and domain-driven design is the right thing to do there. So apply domain-driven design. If you want to do another to-do list application on a mobile and that has to be very pretty and perfect UX, you may not want to care about domain-driven design. You may just want to go CRUD, the simplest thing that works. And maybe later, when the domain complexity is more obvious to you, you may evolve into something more DDD. But right now, it doesn't make sense at the moment. So we want to focus on the core domain. The core domain is what's differentiating to the business. So you should ask yourself, is this feature part of something differentiating to my business? And if that's the case, you should apply DDD there. If it's not the case, you could even wonder, why are you developing it? You could take it from the shelf, like something open source, take it or buy it or partner or something like this. All right, so now we are in a case where you want to do domain-driven design. That's the right thing to do. It all starts with domain curiosity. We are developers, and yes, we should be curious about the domains, about insurance, finance, distributions, e-commerce. And in practice, when I join the team, every time I join a team, I see people like this. So one time it was a colleague, he was an architect, and he was something like this, like, I only care about Java, EE, 6, all these things, learning all the details, and that's fine. But I arrive and I say, hey, by the way, you know, finance is cool too. It's very geek-ish as well. You should like it. And after a while, he's thinking, looking around, hey, and that's more interesting than I thought. This business domain is interesting. I want to know more about it. And then it's kind of ignites interest in your team. And after a while, your team gets really knowledgeable about domain. And you get better because of that. So when we say talking about the business domains, of course, we are talking about a lot of examples, business stories, business scenarios, and that's of course, when I say business scenarios, you think BDD. You know BDD, by the way? Who's comfortable with BDD here? Not just Cucumber, the BDD, conversations between the three amigos. And so you see, after these conversations, you can turn them into files, like here. But you don't have to, but you end up with a regression test for free if you do that. But anyway, so here we have the capture of the conversations that took place between the three amigos. And we mention why we wanted to do this anomaly detection in the fleet management. This system is all about detecting when you have full cards, the drivers can use the full cards maybe for themselves, and they can steal money from the company. So we want the system to detect that here. And so that's the intent. We want the system to say that, hey, there's something curious in the fuel transactions, and you should have a look and ask questions to the driver. So for instance, so that's the intent. And then you have the concrete examples. And the concrete examples are very important. Like, if a driver is on a vehicle with 48 liters tank, and if he got some 52 liters transaction, fuel card transaction, there is a question to be asked to the driver. The same thing, the next example is, if there is a fuel card transaction for oil on close to the Eiffel Tower, for instance, but if the GPS of the car was reporting that at this time the car was 2 kilometers away, there's another question to be asked to the driver too. So that's the business here. And you see, I told you basically nothing about this domain, but thanks to these examples, you are very quickly up to date, and you could join the team and work with me immediately. So yeah, it's time for the first little kitten in this talk, because that's from time to time you have to relax, take a deep breath, and hey, smile. Kitten time. All right? I got my kitten time. The next important thing about DDD is modeling, and modeling with code. Abstract again, so we need an example. Example, please. So your business person is telling you, please add a new discount mode. And your question is, where do I put that? Oh, I know. I'll add the code to the main controller class, as usual. Yeah, the problem is that this main controller class tends to be big. But it's always the right place to put anything, because we got anything there. Every data you may want, every helper, every method, everything is there. Yeah, I see you recognize the situation. And so it's always the easiest place to put any new stuff, except that it gets out of proportion. And actually, there's a name for it. But that's not the name for it. That's the reaction. And the name for it is from Carlo Pescio. He calls that the phenomenon of code gravity. Big stuff attracts more stuff and gets even bigger, and attracts even more stuff, and so on and so on. Like you see like planets, like these big planets, and there's a comet going around. One more thing, and next the attraction gets better, and so one little dirt at a time, it gets big and big and big, and at the end, how does it end? Black hole, right? No, it doesn't end well. Just like in your code. In the keynote this morning, it was all about that. Legacy, how does it evolve, and all these things. At the end, you'll have to do something costly and expensive. So it doesn't end well. We have to resist. And to resist gravity, what do? We need energy. We need to fight that with energy. And the energy is your skills as a developer. We call it design usually. And here on domain-driven design, we'll talk about domain modeling as the energy to fight that. And we want to express the business domains as code, literally, and we'll spend energy for that. So let's start with something extremely simple. Just we have the domains. We have two domains. We have payment and we have discounting. Similar, but not the same thing. And our new feature should go in the discounting. And every time we have a new feature, we'll have to spend some time and some energy to say, hey, it goes there. It goes in the bathroom. It doesn't go to the kitchen. It doesn't go to the bedroom. Actually, that's what you do when you clean up your house. The right thing at the right place. In the code, there's the same thing, and we do it based on the domain. That's how we do it in a domain-driven design way. So everything insurance there, everything accounting there, everything discounting there, everything customer loyalty there. It's not the same thing. It's very close. It happens during the payment. It's similar. We split it. And we do it a lot, and we refactor because of that. Because at the beginning, we didn't have these two things separated. So at some point, we acknowledge they are different, and we extract them, and we separate them. We do domain-driven refactoring, indeed. You see, when you do refactoring, it's not just duplication and, hey, I extract the duplication. It's duplication, and we have to find out what does it mean from a business perspective, and I want refactoring that makes sense for my business colleagues. So domain modeling in practice has nothing to do with UML or MDA. No, nothing to do. This is a bad model. It's already much too hairy. That's a better model. It didn't take too much time to do. And it didn't take too much time to do. It's something on a napkin. And there are fewer associations. That's a much better model. But still, you don't need UML. Let's take another example. Let's take the domain of singing kitten. I'm sure it exists somewhere, maybe in Japan or something like this. And so you have this domain that you see in front of you. And so how do I model that into code? I will just use Java there to express this domain. So we have kitten, a little kitty, of course. And we have something that you can't take. It's an intangible, like the attitude. But you agree with me that the attitude in rock music is very important. It's everything, the attitude. And we have the microphone, and we have the concept of singing. It's not just nouns, it's also verbs. So we can sing. And it's not just taking notes in static code. The code can be executed. So when you run it, you have this concept of playback. And when you run the code, in the console, you should see something like mew mew. Or if you put it into the loudspeaker with the text-to-speech, you should hear mew mew mew. Something like this. It should move. It should do something at runtime. And that's the way you model businesses in plain Java code. And you can run the code. And it does something which tells you if you understood correctly, by the way. That's very important. So let's take another example of a simple model. The simplest possible model is from DDD Borat, because there is a Borat in DDD. And actually, this Borat gives a lot of bad advices, but also some good insights from time to time. And so you see here, the simplest model for deciding if you need to take an umbrella when you go outside in London is a constant Boolean equal to true, of course. It makes sense. So that's the very simplest possible model, but it's a model, and the naming makes a lot of sense. Real rain, yes. So how do you know you have a good modeling? You know when your colleagues and new joiners, they can learn the domain, by reading the code and by running the test as well. And they can also change the test. They can change the value and say, if I understood well, this should do like this. I change the value, proof, oh yeah, so I understood correctly, or oh, I'm missing something because the result is not what I expected. The other thing, once you do that consistently, you end up with something funny. Maybe you have CTO around you, CTOs talking things like this. Maybe you have. I have heard that repeatedly in the past. And every time I was saying to myself, that's bullshit. Yeah. But when you do DDD consistently, you end up in a situation where, hey, I know how to do that, and I do it all the time. I'm aligning my code to the business, just like the big guys in suits wants us to do. What we want to do is that if we think of the domains as three things like this, like three potatoes, domain-driven design typically is potatoes diagrams, domains diagrams, then that's the problem in the domain space, in the problem space. Then I want, whenever I can, I want exactly the same boundaries on my software systems. I want alignment. That's what it means, alignment. I also want alignment of purpose and vision, of course, but that's another topic. So I want something like, that's the common heuristic when you do domain-driven design. All right, so we need some more examples of all this. Example, please. You can scream, huh? You can scream. Example, please. Oh, you're shy. You're sleepy? No. So I can, yeah. So imagine we have these two modules in your system, in your software system. You have decision making, and you have the vehicle dispatching in my fleet management system. And there is the dependency cycle. That's bad, of course. So you want to cut this cycle. But the problem is that you can cut in two different ways. So I know you have some tools which can give you the DSM, the dependency matrix, and they can tell you that it's easier to do it this way or this way. But I don't care. Actually, I don't want to do the easiest possible thing. I want to do the thing that makes most sense from a business perspective. So actually, for me, it's a business question. from a business point of view, which dependency makes more sense than the other. And here we are in a classical case, by the way, of something more like the strategy depending on the tactic, depending on operation and all these things. So typically decision-making is very kind of strategic-ish and should depend on the other, not the other way around. That's a common heuristic as well. But anyway, it's a business domain decision. We ask the business people, and they say, I should cut the one at the top. Yeah, the cut is not on the line, sorry. So it's a business decision, and I want to literally make a decision, a technical impact from the business decision, literally. That's another example of what I would call alignment between the business and the code. All right, so, and now for something a little bit different. So all this was the very important things about DDD. The rest is details now. And now we're going to talk about the tactical patterns, the thing that everybody is talking about when you look for domain-driven design on the internet. It's not the important stuff there. So tactical patterns, you've heard about them already. You've heard that there are three kinds of classes. You have value objects, entities, and services. Actually, that's domain services. So let's have a look at them quickly. Value objects are just classes defined with an equality defined by value. So typically, if your fields are equal 1-to-1, all of them, between your two instances, then your instances are equals. Basically, that's your equals by default generated by your IDE. And the hashcode goes with it. So that's the definition of a value object. But you also want a value object to be immutable. So you want to make sure that every field is private final. And if it's a collection, you should not expose it directly. It should be returned as a copy or unmodifiable version of it, something like that. And in practice, that's what I meant. You have a constructor, and that's the only way to change. You can't change the value, actually. Once you instantiate it, you can't change it anymore. You don't need any getter-setter most of the time. Sometimes you need the getters, but you never want the setters. And it's kind of important to have a correct toString, because you want the toString to speak the domain language as well, of course. And it's very convenient for you. Apart from that, you notice that there is a method inside, because this value object has nothing to do with the DTO. A DTO is a document, just like a JSON document. But a value object is part of a domain model, and is part of the behavior of the domain model. And value objects are real classes doing real work. They do the computations. That's why they don't need many getter-setters. Why, if you need getters to do the job outside, it's a bad thing. You should do the job inside and have it directly on your class, like good old object orientation. So here we have a look at this method. This method is doing, shifting days, like +2 open days or +3 calendar days, these kind of things. And there's a mode to do that. And the calendar are working. So that's the first version of the code, and it's a wrong version, because now we can refactor that using the polymorphism from the Java enum, which is much better. And even enums will be value objects with behavior inside, thanks to the polymorphism of Java enums. Java enums are fantastic, really, really, really. They are the closest thing to they are the best things that happened to Java recently. Well, recently it was. But I've seen it up here. Yeah, it was a great day. So typically in Java, the Java enums are the closest thing to value objects. So I use them whenever I can. But of course, we can't do everything with enums. They are finite possible values. But the Scala case class is basically a perfect value object, but in Scala. There are the JSR coming in soon, I hope. Soon. Soon, in the context of Oracle, means ages, but anyway, and entities. So that's for the value objects. Basically, I use value objects as a default every time, and I only consider something different when I really have to. So I suggest you do the same. Value objects, value objects, value objects all the time. So entities are different. They have the same equality, the same identity, even though the internals are changing over time. So from an administration point of view, for the tax, for instance, for the tax system, I'm the same person from my birth to my death, even though my weight, for instance, has been changing and my face has been changing as I get older. So my name and my first name and second name are my arbitrary identity. Everything else is changing, but I'm still the same. So from this point of view, I'm an entity. But from a biological point of view, I'm not an entity. I'm a set of atoms, and I could compare a set of atoms to another, so I would be a value object from a biological point of view. So actually, you can be both. You can be from different point of view. You can be a value object or an entity or something else. So now for the domain services are defined as not a value object and not an entity, which is very, very helpful as a definition. Oh yeah, I did something wrong here. Giving the illusion of an in-memory collection is for a specific kind of services, which we call repository. Oh, the return of the repository anyway. So the repository, as far as I see it, are a special case of domain services. For the case where you have this, you have something like a database or a middleware or something technical, and of course, you don't want to see this something technical in your domain, because this something technical, like Postgres or Kafka, is not part of your ubiquitous language in insurance or in e-commerce. So you need some trick to be able to deal with this middleware, even though you don't want to use their name. Which means that you do have a DIO somewhere, maybe a Postgres DIO or Oracle DIO, but from a domain perspective, in the domain model on the top, I want an interface which has a domain name. And of course, thanks to the DIP, the D of solid, the DIP, dependency inversion principle, I can always inverse a dependency. So I may call a DIO without knowing about the DIO. I'm calling the interfaces, and at runtime, I will call the DIO thanks to the implementation and runtime binding mechanism. So what I want is something like maybe the catalog in my domain model. This word catalog is part of my ubiquitous language. This catalog has methods from the business domain language, like every book or every item or item with a name such as, or something like this. Basically, they are finders, but we don't want to use the name find by primary key or these kind of things because it's not part of our domain. And we will have an adapter at the bottom. So actually, this DIO can do the adaptation itself, or you can have an adapter on top of the DIO, but it doesn't matter, as long as it's outside. And in your infrastructure layer, you will have all the technical details to do the job with your whatever technology, middleware, and all these things. So actually, what we want is give the illusion of a collection in memory from the domain perspective, even though it's implemented through a middleware. The repository pattern is really that. It's a trick. It's a way to dress up your technology as with business domain close. Got it? So it's a good thing. Anyway, look, once you're understanding it this way, the repository pattern is a very good thing to do, and you should do it. It helps do these patterns of repository helps doing something that we call persistence ignorance, which is not for every case, but every time the business domain is the most difficult part, you could do like this, starting to implement your domain model outside independently of everything technical around, and then after a few, maybe 2 weeks or 3 weeks, when it works, once you know how it works, once you know the usage patterns, then you implement the adapters to the middleware around, like the database, the bus, messaging, all these things. it helps a lot because once you know how you use the external infrastructure, you know better which technology to choose and how to tune it. That's very, very important. So you don't have to choose your technologies, your database, upfront. You can start with your domain model. Every time the domain model is complex, every time you want to do domain-driven design, you will do the domain first, and then choose the technology later. Later can be 3 weeks. Don't wait too much. Don't wait too long anyway, because otherwise it will get harder and harder to do over time. So yeah, repository is a good thing. And so now it's time for the second kitten time, because I talked a lot. Smile? Still with me? Yeah. All right, so the tactical patterns were not the most interesting part of domain-driven design, really. But I kept some very interesting part for the end. It's called strategic design. And strategic design is all about bounded context. You heard about bounded context before? No? Yeah, a little bit? This morning, actually, David Moore mentioned the fracking the domain, fracking the system into boundaries. Actually, he was spot on bounded context, and I'm pretty sure he knows about it, even though he didn't use the name. And actually, it's very common that people use this concept without using the name bounded context because they are afraid of threatening their audience. But once you know, you recognize very frequently, you recognize the concept in many talks from many different speakers. So that's the definition of a bounded context, and I let you read and understand. No, I'm kidding. Of course, you can't understand this concept from this text. You see? No, it's totally, no, you can't. Nobody can understand bounded context by reading this text. So instead, we need some examples. So imagine you are building a startup in e-commerce. So you start with a shopping cart and all these things, and you have this customer concept, and you have the customer class with the address line, the zip code, and the city. Normal things. And it works. You start shipping, you start having customers, everything's okay, until after a few months you have your first company customers, corporate customers, and they need a different billing address than a shipping address. Make sense? So you are like, oh, I know, let's add the second address with a flag. Like this. Boom. Second address, and a flag when to say that they are not the same. And actually to say that the second address is not empty. That's why it works. So I was thinking that this example was a bit caricatural, but many times when I say that, some people told me that, hey, you're already lucky, you're better than our system. Our system doesn't even have the flag. We have to check null on the fields. So, right, so it's a better solution already. And you, of course, this is not enough. You have to live with these if statements everywhere. Everywhere. If they are the same, I do like this. If they are not the same, I need to check the values from there or from there, and there, and there, and there, everywhere. No. I made a lot of noise in this talk. So what we have is a code mess by lack of domain understanding. And the solution to that is bounded context. And typically, we take the domain, the big domain, so you may be in e-commerce, but e-commerce is very big as a domain, and it's made of subdomains. And we identify the subdomains, and we split the system by subdomains. It's written. So we've done it here, and we found 2 subdomains. Actually 3 here. We have the shopping cart. But on this address thing, we split it into 2 parts. And what do you notice there? We changed the name. So we have these 3 domains: billing, shipping, shopping cart. And so these are our bounded contexts there. So the bounded context is the technical solution, the packages, for example, modules. And, but they have the same name than the domains that we use to split them. So again, that's alignment. And we have new names. We had the customer, and we still have a customer somewhere, or maybe not. And what the important part is that we have the account, because from a billing perspective, we don't care about the customer. We want something that we can bill, and send invoices to. And from a shipping point of view, we have a recipient, because that's all what matters to us. It's not a customer. We don't care it's a customer. It's just some address and some contacts that we can send a package to, a parcel to. So we have new names. So if we take the inventory of all our names, we have the customer, we have account, we have recipient. They are close synonymous in everyday conversations. We can use one for the other very commonly. But if you pay attention, if you listen carefully, just by having different names coming in different conversations, they can suggest these domains and subdomains. When we hear recipient, implicitly you are talking shipping, of course. And it's a suggestion that you have something like shipping context in your system. All right, and of course, once you do that, you need default values. You need defaulting. Defaulting is very important by doing that, because you don't want to change the UX. You still want the users, the customers, to fill in the screen and to have the checkbox. My billing address is the same as my shipping address, and you want the data to be copied in the two systems at the same time when you register. So you need a copy of data. So at this point, once you try to do that, your colleagues or managers will say, that's massive duplication. Remember, you have these three address fields in the account class, you have the same fields in the recipient class, and you have a default data, a defaulting system, which copies most of the time the same data and puts the same data in the three fields there and the three fields there. So we have duplication of schema and a duplication of data. Excellent. And yes, and we still want to do that, because you know what? No duplication just means coupling. Every time you notice a duplication and you want to exploit this duplication, you end up coupled, and you can't move independently. Whenever one is moving, the other has to move the same way, and that's something bad. So actually, I don't want to say it's bad or not. Actually, you have to decide when it makes sense or not, but you have to know that duplication is not something that you want to remove all the time. If you value independence, if you value autonomy and decoupling, you may want to end up with duplication, explicit duplication, for the purpose of autonomy. And here, I want this decoupling, because strategic means long term. And here, I know that my shipping context and my billing context are independent. They don't evolve for the same reasons. So I want them to be separated. Let's have a look at what could happen in our system. From a billing perspective, the new features will be something like tax region, contact name, from a tax purpose, or something like billing oriented. On the other hand, from a shipping perspective, the evolution will be more like door code, availability time slots for the people, for the drivers to ship my parcels. You see, they evolve differently for different reasons, for different directors in your company. And the directors, their job is not to be in agreement with each other all the time. Actually, it's totally the opposite. And so if you take that into account, you should not couple your technical systems together. You should keep them loose, even if it costs some duplication of schema and some duplication of data. And actually, the duplication of data is not one. It's a coincidence where the shipping address is the same than the delivery address and than the billing address. It's a coincidence. They are not the same thing, essentially. And by the way, if you buy to a marketplace, you don't even have a one-to-one relationship between all these things. And remember, when I buy gifts for my nephew, the recipient is not me. I'm the customer, but the recipient is my nephew. And if I buy to a marketplace and there are different sellers, they can sell in different parcels, different billing, different delivery requests, and I can be billed again differently. So all these things are different, and by just tying them together into the same customer or the same purchase class is a very bad idea. So another example, a book on Amazon. It's totally fictitious, but it's kind of, we could imagine it done like this. So from the catalog perspective, the book looks like a book. It has a title, a category, authors, a rating, and all these things. But from a search perspective, it has nothing to do. It's an Elasticsearch index, which has a totally different shape. Just like the web and Google, you see, they are totally different, and they are totally duplication of each other. The web is made of pages full of words, and the index, the search index, is totally the opposite. It's made of words full of pages. It's an inverse index. And the data are copied, a lot of data are duplicated between both of them. But it makes sense. You want them to evolve independently for different reasons and to be good at something different. Reading the page or searching from words. Search is almost always its own subdomain and bounded context, I would say. So shopping cart, shipping, recommendation, a naive recommendation system is just people who bought these IDs also bought these IDs. We don't care about books, actually, from this point of view. It's just a graph of IDs, a graph of identifiers. So bounded context, this idea is that you may have a 3D thing, but you may want to look at it from a 2D perspective each time. This means that you can decide to have two 2D models instead of one 3D model. If you find that it's easier, then you should do that. I skipped a slide here. So bounded contexts are candidates for choosing a different technology, something like polyglot persistence from Martin Fowler. You may change your storage technology to choose the best one for each bounded context. And it's a good heuristic to do, because on each context, you have a very different usage pattern. Typically, your catalog is mostly read-only. And recommendation system is as well. And the shopping cart typically will be RDBMS, because you want something rock solid. You don't want to lose any payment. And even if you trust other technology, you don't want to put your job at risk because of this kind of choice. And you can go further and align your teams on top of it and have different teams with different expertise. And all right, so these bounded contexts are not totally independent. Of course, the recommendation comes from the data comes from the shopping cart. But we don't want them to be transactionally consistent. We want them to be eventually consistent, which means it will happen as a background. This synchronization will happen in the background. So by the way, what we mentioned as bounded context right now, it should ring a bell to you, because what I said is something like this. When we follow bounded context, we end up with bounded context with services on top, loosely coupled, because we want them to be independent. And that's the definition of, anyone? Microservices by Adrian Cockcroft from Netflix, formerly Netflix. Yes, bounded context is exactly what you need to do microservices right. And I had to mention it because no talk on domain-driven design should be complete without mentioning microservices. All right, a little recap. DDD framework. Do we need a domain-driven DDD framework to do DDD? Yeah. No, you're trolling. I love it. No. No, but on Wikipedia, domain-driven design, there used to be 21, at least a list of 21 DDD frameworks, so-called DDD frameworks. You don't need them. What languages? I don't care. Actually, you can do it in every language, except that in C++ it will be extremely hard, and in assembly it will be close to impossible, and in F# it will be a brief. So some languages are better than others. Typically, functional languages like Clojure, F#, maybe Scala, Haskell are better. F# is very, very good on it. Is domain-driven design for you? If you feel close to Martin Fowler and extreme programming, definitely yes, because it's in the same space. But if you feel closer to distributed caches, then it will be harder for you because it's not really your thing right now. So if you really want to be into domain-driven design, it will be harder. And how to go further? Read the Blue Book, but maybe don't start by the Blue Book. I can give you better books to start with. Read the Blue Book later. It's the best book, but it's not the best introductory book. Read Martin Fowler, and try event storming. Thank you very much. I feel a bit like this. Domain-driven design!